Hello, I'm Peter Boswell with the Atlantic Grains Council. The Council represents over 1,000 grain and oilseed farmers from across the Atlantic provinces of Canada. This video is supported with funding from producer checkoff dollars, as well as the governments of Canada, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, and Newfoundland and Labrador through the Canadian Agricultural Partnership Program. Thank you to the CAP program, the Council's checkoff partners, and producers for their contributions to move our industry forward. With me today is Dan MacEachern, biologist with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada's Charlottetown Research and Development Centre. Today, Dan will highlight some of the work he and his team are conducting on behalf of the Atlantic Grains Council for farmers across the Atlantic provinces. Dan, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Peter. As Peter said, I'm Dan MacEachern. I'm with the Charlottetown Research and Development Centre of Agriculture Agri-Food Canada. And today I'm going to be going over a project funded by the Atlantic Grains Council, looking at improving corn test weight here in Atlantic Canada. So basically in this presentation, I'm going to cover what is corn test weight, why is corn test weight important, the overall project layout, as well as go over some results. So what is corn test weight? Well, essentially, it's the bulk density of the grain. So it's measured by looking at the mass per unit volume of a grain. And so what we do is use a Cox funnel, and we drop grain down through the funnel, filling up a cylinder of known volume, usually either half a liter or a liter. Then we take a wooden striker and we saw off the top so that the grain is flush with the top of the cylinder, and then we weigh that. And from there, we can get what is known as our test weight, and it's expressed in Canada as kilograms per hectoliter. So it's only one aspect of grain quality, but it's a pretty good indicator. When I say pretty good indicator, I mean pretty good indicator of grade. So from the Canadian Grain Commission's website here, I've brought up the primary and export grade determinants table. Excuse me. And if we look here off to the left, we have different grades, grade num 1 through to 5. And so for grade 1, you need to have a minimum test weight of 68 kilograms per hectoliter, or 343 grams per half liter. And to get a 5, a minimum test weight of 68 kilograms per hectoliter, or 291 grams per half liter. Now there's other things that go into determining the grade of corn, and they're represented in this table. Damage, such as heated kernels, foreign material, cracked corn, things of that nature. So why is test weight important? Well, a higher test weight equates to a higher density kernel, and a higher density kernel means you have a higher energy kernel, and so you have a higher feed quality. So grain buyers want it, livestock producers need it, and customers demand it. And what do I mean by that? I mean that if we take beef, for example, what's often considered a high quality beef is beef with a high degree of marbling or a high degree of fat. And the only way you obtain that is through feeding a high energy grain. So a grain with a high test weight like corn. So here in Atlantic Canada, we often have a hard time meeting even grade 2 corn. And most grain elevators have a cutoff of grade 3, meaning they won't purchase anything below a grade 3. And that leaves a pretty narrow window. Either you have to have a 1, 2, or 3 in order to get rid of your product. Well, in 2019, in Atlantic Canada, you were lucky to find grade 4 or 5 corn. In in 2018, it was hard to find grade 3 or 4. So, you know, part of the reason for that is in 2019 we had a pretty severe hurricane. 2018 we had experienced early onset of winter. And so we're faced with a few challenges here on the East Coast. For some perspective, in Nova Scotia, last year they produced approximately 23,000 acres of grain corn, or grew 23,000 acres. New Brunswick, about 10,000 acres, and in Prince Edward Island, approximately 6,000 acres. So for this project, what we did is that over a 3-year period, we tested multiple hybrids of corn. And they were in a range of crop heat units from 2150 to 2650. And then we hit them with multiple treatments. So our control treatment was 150 units of ammonium nitrate. Our second treatment was 2 top dress timings of ammonium nitrate, once at V4 and one at R1. Then we had 2 top dress timings of a liquid urea ammonium nitrate product, once at V4, once at R1. Then we had our control treatment plus a plastic row covering. Then we also had 1 top dress timing of the liquid UAN product applied at V4. And then we also tried out ammonium sulfate at V4. Now for all of these treatments, 50 units of N would have went down, of ammonium nitrate would have went down at seeding, and then the remainder, the 100 units, went down on the forms discussed here. So this was the basic design. Each color represents a different hybrid, and so each treatment was grown within that hybrid 4 times, and that provided a nice Latin square design. And if we look here, this is an aerial view, the day of seeding. And this is just another view. It goes in quite nicely, and the plastic is applied either that day or the day following, as soon as we can after the corn's planted. And this is what the plots look like once they start to take off. So let's get to some results. And here is my corn technician, Chris Fleming, who's a huge help. So if we look at test weight versus the treatments, we have 6 site years of data here, and we see that the plastic treatment was significantly greater than all other treatments, so a significantly higher test weight. And that was followed by the ammonium sulfate treatment, which provided higher test weights than the control treatment, as well as higher than the liquid UAN with a split application. And there was a trend of it being higher than the other 2 treatments. So pretty strong results. But one thing you might notice here, I have the grade off to the side, and so to get a number 1, there's the minimum weight per half liter, and that's what's represented here on that table. And we'll see here that even with plastic, over the 6 site years, we only had a mean would get a number 3 grade corn, followed by a number 4 from the next 2 treatments, then a number 5. So that's a little misleading, and the reason for that is that our 2019 data is included here. And as I said earlier, we were hit by a hurricane, and that greatly reduced our mean. So we'll call this the hurricane data. Regardless, these trends are still very important. So if I remove that 2019 data, we see results that are a lot more promising. First off, it's the exact same trend, with the exception of just the control and the liquid UAN split application have swapped places. But we see here that the plastic and ammonium sulfate treatments tend to be in the lead, with the plastic being significantly greater than all other treatments. And we also see that our test weights are significantly better. So under normal growing conditions or normal years, we were able to reach a grade 1 corn with the plastic, as well as a pretty good test weight from the ammonium sulfate treatment. It was 1 gram off of being or making grade 1. So another thing we did here is that we had broken up our hybrids into crop heat units. So to give us a range of crop heat units. So We have early, mid, and late. Early being 2050 to 2200, mid being 2300 to 2400, and late being 2500 to 2650. And if we look here at the bar graph, we'll see that the later maturing hybrids produced a lower test weight than the other two. In fact, there was no difference between the early and the mid. So moving on to some yield results, I thought I'd throw this slide in here, and this is from Mexico Daily News, and it's just showing back there in January 2020, the world's largest corn cob measured 39.5 centimeters. And I put that in here just to show the amazing potential of this crop when it has all of the resources and heat units that it needs. So we look here at yield versus the treatment, 6 site years of data. We'll see that unlike the plastic, which produced the highest test weights, the ammonium sulfate produced the highest yield. So the ammonium sulfate treatment was significantly higher than the control treatment and higher than the both rates of the liquid UAN or application timings. It also showed a strong trend of producing a higher yield than the plastic and the split application of ammonium nitrate. And looking at some data here, one of the reasons for that is that if we look at the cob weight overall, the ammonium sulfate treatment produced a larger cob than any of the other treatments. So if we look at crop heat units again, this time we see that the later maturing hybrids also produced a lower yield than the other two categories, the early and the mid, with the mid producing the highest yield, followed by the early. So if we think back to the other table that I was showing, there was no difference in test weight between the early and mid, but yet we're seeing a higher yield from the mid. That would lead to believe that you'd be better off growing a mid-range 2300 to 2400 crop heat unit hybrid. Now, another important thing to note, a 2500 to 2600 crop heat unit corn might not be considered late in other parts of the world. It may be considered early, but just for the purposes of this project, this is what we went with. So some general observations and some discussion. I'd like to talk about this plastic briefly. And so this row cover plastic, essentially what it does is create greenhouse conditions on top of the soil. It's warm and humid, and it creates a nice growing environment at rooting depth. So when we place data loggers in at rooting depth underneath the plastic and then outside of the plastic at the same depth, we'd see that the temperature under the plastic ran about 5 to 10 degrees warmer on average. And so the end result is a corn seed that germinates quicker and a plant that emerges from the soil 7 days earlier. So that was on average about 7 days earlier it would emerge. So this film that we used was from Matterby, and it was 100% compostable mulch film. And it was a pretty amazing product in that it really did break down. And so by the end of the season, it was hard to tell that it was even there. If we look here, this is some of our plots in Nova Scotia. There were some downfalls with it. It was hard for the plants to break through this product. And so it was recommended to us that you'd go along and cut holes in it to let the plants out, but that's not feasible in commercial production of corn. So another downside is that it can hold weeds. So this is a picture of the Prince Edward Island plots very early in the spring last year, or in 2020. And you can see that this is before our herbicide was applied and before we took advantage of the Roundup Ready trait. But what happened here is that the plants essentially cooked underneath the plastic. And so what happened here is that due to COVID-19 restrictions, we were late getting planting our corn. And so it was planted around the 1st of June. And, you know, what we've learned here is that, you know, plastic should only be used if you intend to plant your corn early in the season. It's not intended to be used later in the season. The idea is to give your plants an advantage, create that warm environment so that they're, you know, ahead early in the spring. And if you plant too late, well, then you could just cook them out. And so this ended up happening on Prince Edward Island and also in New Brunswick. And so when it comes to ammonium sulfate, this is an older picture, I believe from 2018. But what I wanted to show here is that if we look right here, we'll see that the plants are a little bit greener, noticeably greener. And so that is the ammonium sulfate treatment. And so after some time, those plants caught up to those under the plastic treatment and then surpassed them. So poor test weight's often the most limiting factor in corn production here in Atlantic Canada. And why is that? Well, I think it's because we have the shorter growing season, and that's why the plastic worked so well. Is what we were doing is essentially extending the growing season, or the opportunity for that crop to fill its grain by about a week. Early frosts are a big problem here. We received frost in 2020 around mid-September, and that greatly affected the plots. And, you know, we can have frost just hit one area of a field, or it can hit an entire field. And any time that a plant doesn't have a chance to dry down naturally, you're going to impact the test weight. And so my field was just a little bit lower than a field across the way, probably no more than about 400 meters away. And it was hit by frost and dried down about 3 weeks earlier than this field that was just across the way. So it makes a big difference. And that field had higher test weights. It had about 3 more weeks to finish off the grain. So and hurricanes are obviously a big problem here. So the weather makes a big difference. And corn's a heavy feeder, so we have to make sure that we meet its nutrient demands and dial in the agronomy as much as possible. And so in the future, we'd like to work on this project and let it evolve. And we'd like to upgrade a few of the treatments. One is that we'd like to look at some alternative sources of nitrogen. We'd like to look at some slow release sources. We'd also like to look at some different sources of sulfur. And then we'd like to change to a perforated plastic, which is more commonly used in corn production in this neck of the woods. So that's my presentation. I'd like to thank my team out at the Harrington Research Farm who made this possible, as well as thank the Atlantic Grains Council. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Interesting results. One of the things I noticed was the good response to the ammonium sulfate. Any comments?
Yeah, well, in general, sulfur deficiency is not something we used to see. We used to get lots of it, and it used to come from precipitation from acid rain. But now we have buffers on our big industrial smokestacks, which removes a lot of sulfur. So we don't quite have that problem like we used to. We saw a response, like our soil tests at all of our sites were showing sulfur levels to be around the mid-range, which would be about 14 parts per million. And really, that's not enough right now, or as we could see from this, at least for corn. And it would be nice to, you know, try to keep our sulfur levels up around, probably when it comes to a Prince Edward Island soil test, it would be in the high level, which would be probably around 25 parts per million.
Oh, that's interesting, and it seemed to impact on the ability of the crop to produce a good test weight. So it obviously had an impact on maturity.
Yeah, well, and you know what we really seemed to see was it had a result on yield. So we had the highest yields from the sulfur treatments, but we didn't have that from from the plastic treatment. So I guess what the sulfur is doing is it's answering the plant's need. So obviously there is a physiological deficiency. It's not meeting resources to full potential. So if we provide what the plant needs, it can produce a bigger kernel. Now, it's not extending that growing season like the plastic does. So I think that's why we didn't see the significant impact on test weight, and that's why we saw there was such an advantage from the plastic treatment. Essentially, the plant has that extra week to build, to work on the photosynthetic capacity, build carbohydrates, and shove them into that grain. So.
Yeah, and you've touched on what was going to be my next question, Dan. When you look at the combination of test weight and yield, the ammonium sulfate seemed to clearly come out on top.
Yeah, no, it did. So it's pretty interesting, and researchers all over North America are seeing the same thing, and in multiple crop types. Sulfur is a valuable nutrient, and we have to make sure we have enough to meet crop demand. But at the same time, you have to be careful with some of your sources. If you are using an organic form of sulfur, you would have to watch because it could lower your pH. But when using a form like ammonium sulfate, it's known as being pH neutral, so that shouldn't be an issue.
And you commented, Dan, about moving toward a perforated plastic for any of the resulting or future work using plastic as a row cover. Could you comment just on maybe the days after planting or application of the plastic when it started to break down and allowed those plants to move through it?
Yeah, so that was one of the problems we encountered with this particular plastic, Peter, is that it wasn't really breaking down fast enough for those plants to easily poke through. Where over time they did, so as they grew, they would push up through, but not quite as quickly as we would have liked. And so we ended up going through and cutting the tops so that the plants could emerge. With a perforated plastic, I think the corn could break through much easier. But in general, within a number of weeks or a few weeks, you could notice that plastic was becoming a lot more brittle. And then over time, it was amazing how it would break down. And by the following season, we would not find that plastic anywhere in the field. So I'll have to locate some suppliers for new perforated plastic, and we'll be trying that out in the near future.
Well, thanks very much, Dan. I've put your email contact information on the screen here. I want to thank you once again for your presentation on behalf of the Atlantic Grains Council, and thank you to the Grain Council's checkoff partners, producers, and the Canadian Agricultural Partnership Program. So thank you very much, Dan, and have a good day.
Thanks, Peter.